When the dead don't rest, how do you keep them from coming back? For as long as we've been burying our dead, we've been haunted by one question. What happens if they don't stay buried? Throughout history, different cultures have found creative and sometimes eerie ways to keep the spirits of the dead from returning to the world of the living. From burying the dead in our homes to building walls around graveyards, people have developed fascinating ways to contain the restless spirits. Especially at times when the barrier between the world of the living and the dead is said to grow thin, like during Halloween. That is what I want to talk about today. The strategies we've employed over the centuries to contain ghosts, ghoulies, and zombies, and how you can apply that in a fantasy world. Welcome to a Halloween special from Just in Time Worlds with your host, Marie Mullaney. Burial is one of the key ways in which the dead have been contained over the years. And that's the focus of this first part of the video, burial and its evolution through the eons. Of course, we have found many graves from before our species even started building settlements and towns. Our hunter-gatherer ancestors certainly were invested in burying their dead. There's even some interesting controversy about how early burial started and whether the Naledi humans were actually burying their dead in a cave that was found that would date burial back to like 200,000 years or some ridiculous sum of years ago. But there is controversy about whether that discovery was legit, something with peer reviews, etc., etc. I'll link you to Gutsick Gibbons' video on the topic, and you can check that out if you're interested in ancient archaeology and the fights archaeologists have. But today, I don't want to go all the way back to the hunter-gatherers. I want to pick up the thread of burials in the Neolithic period, when people were burying their ancestors inside their homes. In ancient times, the dead were much closer than we might expect to the living, sometimes buried right beneath the floorboard of family homes. It was a common practice in many cultures, not only as a way to honor the dead, but also as a method of keeping them close. In these cultures, ancestor worship often grew out of this proximity of the dead to the living, with families believing that their ancestors watched over them, guiding and protecting them. But what happens when the dead don't stay quiet? What if Grandpa wakes up one day and he wants something more than your reverence? In a world where spirits or the undead can cause real harm, this closeness would have taken on a more dangerous meaning. In my own world of Sangwheel Chronicles, where I write epic fantasy, I explored this idea of community burial as well. Ancient people in that world buried their dead inside their homes, but they also took precautions. When someone died, they would burn down the house of that person, or at the very least, they would burn the body inside the home to set the spirit free, ensuring it wouldn't haunt the place. After all, no one wants a restless ancestor wandering around the living room. That being said, no one's going to fully burn a house. So What really happened is obviously that they burnt the bodies inside the houses and parts of the houses burnt. But very few were so devoted to their ancestors or to their dads and their moms that they burnt the whole house, as it were. But the legend that survives to the time when my story is written is that they burnt the whole house, of course. Now, in the real world, in our world, there is a version of that fear of the ancestors coming back to haunt us that plays out in our burial rituals. And we see a gradual shift away from burial in the home to other burial practices, both for sanitary reasons, but also because a new idea started growing among the people. The dead could be dangerous to the living. And if dead could be dangerous to living, you have to keep them away from the living. One of the most persistent beliefs in this regard is that the restless dead cannot cross running waters. Is that a superstition you're aware of? Let me know in the comments below. And let's explore a new kind of burial site where water serves as a barrier for ghosts. What if running water really is some kind of barrier? Catherine Kerr treated it as such in her world of Devery, where the water presented powerful forces that would tear a spirit apart. And this was used both offensively and defensively by various mages throughout the series to great effect. It is entirely possible that in a world where something like running water is a barrier, you would bury your dead on islands. You would bury them completely surrounded by water. And I trekked out to a very interesting site in Finland, which is Salmonlahti, a UNESCO burial site, a UNESCO heritage site, which is also a Bronze Age burial site. And these were the graves that I saw there. What we have going on here is multiple burial cairns, right? So we've got burial cairn over on this side where you would take the ashes up into the central kist area. We've got a smaller cairn over here on this side. And then over there on the hill, we have the massive kind of stone church along with um, the Bronze Age burial sites. And one of the things that I always emphasize when I'm talking about culture building is the hierarchy and flex status. And it is entirely possible that these cairns were different kinds of status people. So you had people who merited their own smaller cairns, but were apart from like the big hilltop. You had the big hilltop where there's a cairn right at the top and then a big centralized stone church. Potentially, all of those burial places were indicators of cultural status. Now, the thing is, when I visited Salmonlahti, there was no water around that area. It's very swampy. However, there's something you should know about Finland. Finland has been under a glacier, or was under a glacier during the glacial maximus for a very long time. And because of the ice pressure, the land actually decompressed. So 2,000 years ago, when these graves were being built, when they were building these cairns, these were islands. They were an archipelago that was filled with ocean floor. Now, the thing is, today we walk through here, we walk through the swampy area. So if you had characters exploring a cairn or like an area that had previously been an island, those people who originally built the graves and the cairns and so on were probably putting their dead on isolated islands. And so the water would have protected them. But they would perhaps only have had access to the causeways. But in a millennia, when people are discovering these things, it's all easily explorable. So it is entirely possible that those early Bronze Age burials were set on these islands, and the salt water served as a barrier for the ghosts. This is not, I mean, we have no evidence of this. I am speculating, but it could be. And in your world, it could be that way as well. And then what happens if, for whatever reason, that water barrier goes away? You have a sudden influx of ghosts that are looking to destroy the living. And that could be a very, very fascinating start to a dark fantasy series. But I do want to get back to another interesting topic from earlier times, and that of ancestor worship and ghostly spirits. The Romans both revered their ancestors and feared the pollution of the living by the dead, and so they invested in the concept of lares. So if you've enjoyed this discussion of burial sites, hit that thumbs up button and let's talk about household spirits. The lares were believed to be the spirits of deceased ancestors who continued to influence and guard the family that they belonged to. The reverence of the lares reflects the belief that the dead, if honored properly, could offer protection to the living. However, this practice carried the inherent risk that spirits who were not at peace could become restless. An ancestor not properly respected could become angered, leading to dire consequences for the family. This idea of ancestral spirits taking a darker turn is echoed in Jacqueline Carey's book, Kashil's Scion, where ancient beliefs about the dead manifest in a haunting way. In the story, a ghost possesses his grandson in order to defend their ancestral home. And in this case, the dead does not simply seek reverence, but instead they impose their will on the living. And while there is benefit to this possession, it does help defend the ancestral home, it is certainly not a natural or benevolent thing for the dude who actually gets possessed. This connection between Roman ancestor worship and ghost possession in literature underscores the complex relationship between the living and the dead, where honoring the ancestors can turn into a perilous endeavor if the spirits demand too much. In your world, do you have ancestor worship? Can the ancestral spirits actually manifest? Can they possess their descendants? Or do people believe that they once could? Let me know in the comments below. And let's speed through the timeline of burial practices to Middle Age Europe, where the dead were not just buried close to churches, but also walled in. So this is the remnants of a Franciscan friary, which was destroyed during the Reformation. And leading on from our graveyard theme earlier, we have some graves spread around here. And again, you'll notice that there is little walls around those graves, and that the church walls itself remain intact in order to keep the ghosts in. As we saw in that clip from Rauma, by the medieval period in Europe, most burials occurred in churchyard. This practice was driven by Christian beliefs in resurrection and the sanctity of being buried in holy places. The dead were seen as a part of the community of the faithful, and burial in sacred ground was important for them to find heaven. It was also one of the threats that the popes used during interdict. Basically, they would not allow people to be buried in sacred ground, and there was a belief that if you were not buried in sacred ground, this could result in you not going to heaven, which was a very dire threat used by the popes to force the kings into submission by denying this rite to be performed, the burial rite. Now, besides burying the dead close to churches, the people also constructed walls. And these structures were not merely for aesthetics. They not only demarcated the sacred space, but they also contained the spirits in the graveyards. These boundaries symbolized a clear division between the realms of the living and the dead, preventing the spirits from crossing back into the living world. This concept of using walls to contain supernatural forces persists in modern fiction today. For instance, in both the Dresden Files by Jim Butcher and Anita Blake stories by Laurel K. Hamilton, barriers are often used to control the undead and restless spirits. This includes everything from the thresholds of a home, which I've spoken about previously, link in the information card, to the walls of a graveyard. And those walls don't have to be big, they can be little walls. It's the symbolism that counts to keep the spirit contained in the graveyard. And of course, running water also works to contain the restless spirits. The enduring use of walls as a containment method in literature highlights our standing anxiety about the restless dead and the need to clearly define the space they occupy, both physically and supernaturally. In your world, do people use graveyards? How do they demarcate them? Are there barriers, be they physical, magical, or spiritual, that contain these restless dead? Let me know in the comments below. Today, we've explored how different cultures, both ancient and modern, have dealt with the restless dead, from the intimate burials inside home from our early agricultural history, to using running water as a barrier, to revering and fearing ancestral spirits, and even to walling in the dead to keep them at bay. Each of these practices reveals a deep, universal concern about the boundary between life and death and what happens when that boundary weakens. In a fantasy world, these concepts can inspire rich, haunting stories. Maybe your people use rivers to separate the living from the dead, or perhaps they construct towering walls around sacred burial grounds. But no matter how they try to contain these restless spirits, there's always the chance that those boundaries could fail. And what would happen then? If you'd like to explore that topic more with other world builders, you can join my Discord server, where there's a whole community of world builders ready to talk, and there's a link to that down below. If you like what I do here and you would like to support the channel financially, you can check out my books on the link down below. There is an epic fantasy series, a science fantasy series, and a spicy fairy series. So something for everyone with world building that I'm proud of. But please don't feel pressure to support the channel financially. You can also show how much you love the channel to the algorithm just by watching another video. And if you enjoyed this video, you might enjoy my video on how vampires evolved from creatures of horror to sparkling teen heartthrobs. And I will see you soon for another episode from Just in Time Worlds, where we build what we need when we need it.